is drawn from that experience of the research. And I would like to highlight today discussion of solidarity practices. And I have planned to talk for about 30-40 minutes. And then I open up the floor for questions until 12 o'clock. So in the lecture today, I will recognize solidarity practices. I will go beyond strivings for sameness or similarity that solidarity practices often can assume or relate to. I will talk about solidarity practices as effective engagements of working together. And I will introduce notions of solidarity as community coalition building that can be embedded in concrete or even imagined relationships. So I will start to talk about solidarity across difference, inspired by Chandra Talpade Mohanty and Jodi Dean. And then I will highlight two particular understandings of solidarity that draw from this notion of solidarity across difference, which is solidarity as practices of shared labor and affective solidarity. And after that, I will give some examples on these forms of solidarity. I will now share the screen. I will open the PowerPoint. So you can see the image here. Can you see it? Does it work? Yeah, perfect. So this is the name of my lecture. Practices of solidarity across borders, belongings, and movements. And so as I said, I have been inspired by the notion of solidarity across difference. And I build on this notion as it has been developed by Jodi Dean and Chandra Talpade Mohanty. And in my own work, I have analyzed activist protests oriented to recognizing and challenging inequalities, relations of oppression that have been based on race, ethnicity, religion, or class, alongside gender and sexuality. And I have sought to illuminate embodied and affective processes involved in coalition building and community building to foster conceptualizations of solidarity that go beyond or against nation-bound or rights-oriented frameworks. I found that the notion of solidarity across difference is very useful for theorizing ideas of solidarities beyond or against nation-bound models. And Jodi Dean, through the notion of reflexive solidarity, Jodi Dean focuses on the acknowledgement of our relationships to one another. She says that solidarity with earlier generations can manifest itself through the recognition of their struggle, pains, and sacrifice. Solidarity toward future generations calls on us to behave responsibly toward our environment. And Jodi Dean explains that solidarity toward present generations is expressed in our willingness to recognize and strengthen the ties that connects all of us. Such solidarity requires us to speak out against oppression and exclusion, to establish and re-establish the public space between us by putting matters before us, to which we must attend, she writes. And Chandra Talpade Mohanty has also written about solidarity across difference, but done that in a slightly different way. She has developed the notion of transnational solidarity, and she writes that a comparative feminist studies or feminist solidarity model is the most useful and productive pedagogical strategy for feminist cross-cultural work. It is through this model that we can put into practice the idea of common differences as the basis for deeper solidarity. And according to Mohanty, this is possible because the idea provides a way to theorize complex relational understanding of experience, location, and history, so that feminist cross-cultural work moves through each specific context. And to both Jodi Dean and Chandra Talpade Mohanty, solidarity practices is considered as political work. Practices of solidarity include coordinated struggles for sharing resources, engaging in symbolic actions, organizing mutually beneficial programs, campaigns, advocacy coalitions, but also small-scale, mundane acts of affinity and friendship. But rather than having a normative status, practices of solidarity can reproduce or subvert imperialist or nationalist assimilationalist projects and inequalities on different levels. Regardless of the intention of activists, community and coalition building might be hampered by cultural and political diversity, class inequality and economic barriers, and physical distance between actors. And greater availability of digital technologies and affordable means of transportation, also with the processes of NGOization, has facilitated the proliferation of transnational solidarity in many parts of the world. But the continuation and deepening of existing global and local asymmetries of power, organized violence and war, and shifts in gender and sexual politics that jeopardize women's and LGBTI people's lives make solidarities difficult to maintain and often susceptible to contention and conflict. In my research with colleagues, I have further highlighted the need for a critical reconsideration of the North-South and East-West binary as the salient framework in which to understand transnational solidarities and the hierarchies inscribed in them. While global inequalities along the Northwest and Southeast axis certainly shape community and coalition building efforts, activists' multiple belonging beyond the national context complicate this picture. Examples of such belongings can be professional, geopolitical, religious, or racial ethnic identifications on regional levels or transnational levels, but also on subnational levels that can challenge the naturalized coalition building of the national context. And in the round of questions, we can perhaps return to discuss these complicating matters more in depth. So I wanted to go into focus on the two specific understandings of solidarity that I wanted to highlight today, which is first, solidarity as practices of shared labor. And in contradistinction to understandings of solidarity that emphasize homogeneity, I've been influenced by scholars who have developed further Durkheim's theorizations of organic solidarity, such as Kathy Wiik and Oscar Garcia Agustin and Martin Bach-Jørgensen. Rather than searching for a position of resemblance or common identity, these scholars bring forth understandings of solidarity as shared labor across difference. They highlight the usefulness of conceptualizing solidarity as doing or acting in everyday life. And Kathy Widlak has further developed Durkheim's ideas around organic solidarity to conceptualize solidarity as a form of working together. Such an act of working together includes the confrontation of dominance and the construction of hierarchies between the parties involved. Shared labor, Kathy Widlak writes, does not rely on empathy, but takes a critical or transformative approach to injustices, challenging material inequalities, and focusing on redistribution as the outcome of solidarity practices. Approaching solidarity as a working together allows us to recognize both material and emotional dimensions of solidarity work, which otherwise might become overshadowed. And this is a form of solidarity that acknowledges that all involved have something to gain from the collective act. And it does so by setting in motion structural effects which go beyond the personal. And the second form of solidarity that I wanted to go a little bit more deep into is affective solidarity. It is presented by Claire Hemmings in the article Affective Solidarity, Feminist Reflexivity and Political Transformation. Here, Claire Hemmings proposes affective solidarity as a way of moving away from rooting feminist transformation in the politics of identity. And she moves towards modes of engagement that start from the affective dissonance experience can produce. And the starting point for her reflection is the recognition that in order to know differently, we have to feel differently. Hemmings understands feminism as a passionate project, which allows for the generation of alternative values. But she asks, how can we move from affective dissonance to affective solidarity? And how can we move from individual experience to collective feminist capacity? And she writes that in order to set in motion a struggle, which is the basis for change, an affective shift has to occur. It is first after the affective shift that we can provide a counter narrative to what was before. And this shift builds on the feeling of affective dissonance. So affective dissonance is the starting point for the creation of solidarity, according to Hemmings. She centers affective dissonance as the basis for feminist solidarity, and she understands feminism as a minority pursuit. And you can see that also here, Hemmings has a clear political understanding of solidarity. Finding that the reflexive activity that she describes allow for reflexive politicization, she finds this to be a productive basis from which to seek solidarity with others. Such affective dissonance is not based in a shared identity or a presumption about how the other feel, but it is based on feeling the desire for transformation out of the experience of discomfort and against the odds. So it starts in the feeling that something is wrong and I want to change this. And in order to, here comes some more points to the PowerPoint. And to illustrate these two understandings of solidarity, I wanted to give two examples, and one of them comes from the article which you have read for today, the article by Oksana Dubchak, and the other example comes from my own ethnographic fieldwork, which I conducted together with Sami people of Sami population in the northern part of Norway. I will begin to discuss the article by Oksana Dubchak and to highlight material and emotional dimension of solidarity. The article Together We Stand, Enforced Single Motherhood and Ukrainian Refugee Care Networks. This article focuses on the everyday dimensions of social reproduction grounded in Marxist theory. The concept of social reproduction illuminates the imbalance between material resources and time. It is an approach that recognizes that material resources are predominantly attained from paid work, and therefore time for reproductive labor needs to find other resources. As Oksana Dubchak writes, informal networks play the dominant role in supporting care in private life in Ukraine. While the role of such networks is crucial, they are naturalized and depoliticized. And further, in the context of war, she writes, displacement and policies that enforce single motherhood among Ukrainian refugees have even more emphasized the role of such informal networks. According to Dubchak, these informal networks have been stitching together the holes in the fabric of social reproduction, and also did so in pre-war Ukraine. But in times of war, women have been further deprived of support from care institutions and networks. And she highlights the strategies that are used in this deficit of care. So there have been care agreements with older generations, and this is related to the capitalist and patriarchal dimension of society. Many families cannot survive on only one salary, which pushes both parents to the labor market and forces them to look for alternative care options. And in times of war, Ducek writes, women flee the country with friends and relatives. They almost directly get involved in domestic and care labor, supporting those in enforced single motherhood. Other strategies involve mobilization of existing networks. Today, destinations of the enforced single mothers are adjusted according to potential networks of support in host countries. As they flee, women often go to a country and a city where someone they know already is located. Network transfers can also involve network spinning, she writes. This happens when women flee the war together with those who have agreed to provide care labor support. They build cooperative families that can be related in different ways, as relatives, friends, neighbors, or even colleagues. In cases where network transfer or mobilization is not possible, women refugees meet in camps and dormitories. These settings become nodes that facilitate mutual recognition and experience, enabling connections where reciprocity of care can emerge. And Oksana Ducek writes that the structures of gender and economic inequalities naturalize women as carers and as the ones responsible for unpaid and reproductive labor. The networks that appear illuminate everyday solidarity and reciprocity. But she writes that the solidarity is not translated into organized collective efforts to deal with the problems of social reproduction and structural inequalities. Refugees' care networks are also fragmented and fluid. They bear the burden of vulnerability rooted in the situation of war and displacement. But sometimes, she writes, they can be used to mobilize Ukrainian refugees in political efforts. And using the concept of affective solidarity, the dissonance experienced between the naturalization of caring roles and the lack of recognition for the need of support may mobilize structural change, encourage collective action for change in relation to the problems of care infrastructure on the level of policy. Alternatively, conceptualizing care work as a kind of solidarity of shared labor could politicize the situation of care networks and initiate a mobilization for change from below. But as of today, as Ducek writes, whether or not this can happen remains an open question. And I'm curious to hear more about your reflections in relation to this in the Q&A later. The second example I wanted to bring comes from my own fieldwork and focuses on solidarity as shared labor and highlights the structural dimensions of solidarity. So solidarity is not only a structure of feeling or empathy, but also brings structural changes to the table. And solidarity as working together, as I described previously, involves the confrontation of dominance. It deconstructs hierarchies between the parties involved. It does not primarily rely on empathy, but it takes a critical approach to injustice. It can challenge material injustice, a focus on redistribution as the outcome of solidarity practice. So that type of solidarity as shared labor sets in motion structural effects which go beyond the personal. And I was in the northern part of Norway to conduct fieldwork on Barents Pride, which was a pride festival in Kirkenes in the Barents region. And the photo you see is from this Pride festival. It was a rainbow mass outside of the church. And in the rainbow mass, which I attended, I was surprised to experience the mass on it was also conducted in Sami language. So it was conducted in Norwegian language and Sami language. And I was very curious about this situation. Also, a Sami woman held a speech and developed part of the ceremony in the church. As I knew that the Sami people had been exposed to a very harsh violence enacted by the Norwegian church during centuries of time and until and also from the Norwegian state going on until the mid-1980s. I was curious to speak with the Sami population in the area, how this could happen, that they were collaborating so much together with the Norwegian church. And through this conversation and through the meeting with the people in the region, I found that religiosity can express acts of solidarity. And for the Sami people in the region, their language had been prohibited for many years. They had been living under the threats of being assimilated to the main Norwegian population due to a program which was called Norwegianization that was going on from the mid-19th century until the end of the 20th century. Sami population had not been allowed to use their Sami language. They had been forced to send their children to schools far away, and they were not allowed to use their own cultural artifacts or clothing. So as this Norwegianization process was going on, the Sami population was about to die out in the region. And in the work of the Sami revitalization process, memory, belonging, and culture were renegotiated and reclaimed through religious rituals. And in this community, the practice of hymn singing started in the mid-1990s. And this was a practice of hymn singing in the Sami language that the Sami population in the area themselves wanted to start up. And my interlocutor, who I spoke with in the region, she explained to me that the work in the local community to bring back the language and the practices and the culture of Sami people in the region started with this hymn singing project. It started in a small scale, but it took place over a period of 20 years that later, until today, has resulted in a Sami revival in the region. People now talk about their heritage. They talk about the multicultural background of the majority of the population in the village. The Sami cultural habits are brought back, such as wearing the traditional Sami coat, for example. So in this way, the hymn singing can be understood as a collective work of solidarity that confronts the violent acts of state actors and institutions, historically and presently. And it started as my interlocutor was invited to the United Nations in Brussels in the year 1993 it was the year of the indigenous populations and focus on anti-racism and post-coloniality. And the participants of this meeting were encouraged to develop self-determination as a strategy to revitalize the communities of the indigenous populations. And my interlocutor went back to her region and asked her people, what do you want to do to revitalize our community? And the people said, we want to sing hymns in our own language. And singing is embodied and effective labor. But I would like to shift away from the performance itself, even though the performance of the hymn singing was certainly important, the embodied and the physical singing and the language. But I would like now to focus on the deeper historical and broader everyday context that surround the practice of hymn singing. So the hymn singing took place as a ritual and collective kind of healing or repair. It wasn't located in an affective register only. It wasn't limited to awaken feelings of empathy among the Norwegian population. But as an anti-colonial project, the singing of Sami hymns incited a process of broader transformation in the region. As inequalities were taken seriously through the collective work, a process of material and symbolic redistribution was generated. And in this work, several actors were involved. Institutions such as the Norwegian Church, which later took the responsibility for conducting the Sami church services. And the Sami Church Council was also involved. The preparation of the church service and the theology is today influenced by Sami cosmology, and the priests in the Norwegian church in this region also learn Sami language. And the responsibility for including Sami presence in the masses now lies with the church and not with the women who started this initiative. And these are some small examples, but they show that solidarity as shared labor can be capable of building political and social change from the ground up. And today, in the region, the Sami presence is clearly visible, and people talk about their heritage, about their relatives, and about the multicultural belonging in the region. So it's not only Sami who is part of this multicultural background, but also they have populations, for example, Kväns, who come from a Finnish-speaking minority. But importantly, solidarity as shared labor is not a quick fix, but it is the result of a long-term struggle involving people of different belongings in the region, as well as institutions, such as the church and the church council, all of which have had an important role in making the hymn singing possible. And with this, I would like to thank you for the attention and open up for questions.